Hello there, and welcome. Before you get too comfortable, just a small invitation. If you find yourself enjoying these quiet strolls through the annals of history, do feel free to like the video and subscribe, just so you never miss a gentle journey like this one. And I'd love to hear from you too. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tonight, we'll be drifting slowly into the quiet, unassuming story of the compass, a modest instrument that over time came to steer great ships and humble caravans alike, guiding explorers across oceans and deserts through thick forests and open plains with a simple, unwavering needle. But long before it adorned the hands of navigators and mariners, the compass began its quiet life deep within the earth itself, as a naturally magnetized stone known to ancient people as lodestone. This isn't a tale of daring voyages or tempestuous seas. Rather, it's the story of magnetism's curious pull on the minds of old-world thinkers, of how a silent stone first drew the attention of scholars in ancient China and slowly, almost imperceptibly, altered the way humanity moved through the world. Across centuries and cultures, the compass remained a humble companion, never grand, never loud, but always pointing steadily northward, even when the world around it changed in restless, noisy ways. And so, we'll begin our gentle journey back to a time when people first noticed the strange, directional tug of certain stones. We'll move softly through dynasties and across trade routes, through monasteries and workshops, watching quietly as the compass made its slow and steady way into the hands of sailors, scholars, and surveyors. A small tool, to be sure, but one that quietly reshaped our relationship with space, direction, and trust in the unseen. Take a breath, settle in under your blanket, and let's begin at the beginning, where stone meets sky and the earth's pull begins to whisper. Long before humanity dreamt of sails billowing over vast oceans or charted star-strewn skies in hopes of finding distant lands, there existed a quiet curiosity, a stone that seemed to tug gently and insistently on fragments of iron. This stone, dark and often rough to the touch, bore a strange property. It attracted certain metals, not with noise or light, but with a subtle force that seemed to arise from within the earth itself. It was known to later ages as lodestone, and it was here that the story of the compass quietly began. Lodestone, or magnetite, can be found in various corners of the world, its magnetism born of natural geological processes, especially those influenced by lightning strikes or the slow cooling of igneous rock in magnetic fields. Ancient peoples did not, of course, understand this process, but they noticed. They observed that some stones clung to iron tools and rings, that they could pick up small shards of metal, and, more mysteriously still, that when suspended or balanced, the stone sometimes oriented itself in a consistent direction. This unchanging behavior, so unlike the drifting uncertainties of wind or wave, piqued a gentle curiosity. In ancient Greece, thinkers such as Thales of Miletus mused upon this curious attraction. Writing in the 6th century BCE, Thales is said to have believed that lodestone had a soul, for it moved iron, living things being, in his view, the only entities capable of movement without external force. There's a kind of poetry in that misunderstanding, a softness in the way ancient philosophers personified the inanimate, giving spirit to stone and meaning to motion. They didn't yet understand magnetic fields or polar alignment, but they watched and wondered. In India, too, references to magnetic stones appeared in early Sanskrit texts. The Arthashastra, a political and economic treatise from around the 4th century BCE, contains passing references to magnetic attraction, though not yet in the context of navigation. It's unclear how these observations were interpreted, whether they were seen as spiritual signs, medicinal tools, or simply natural oddities. But they were noted, passed on, remembered in quiet margins. Egypt, with its towering temples and desert-bound secrets, offers less direct evidence, but given the region's trading ties and intellectual exchanges with the Greco-Roman world, it's possible that Egyptian artisans and scholars too had some acquaintance with magnetism, if only as a curiosity observed in traded stones or described by travelling philosophers. In the Roman world, Pliny the Elder wrote of lodestone in his Natural History, composed in the 1st century CE. He described a hill in India that was said to be made entirely of this attractive stone, so powerful that nails were pulled from the feet of those who walked over it in iron sandals, more likely myth than reality, but a testament to how striking the stone's properties seemed to ancient minds. Pliny, like many of his contemporaries, was drawn more to cataloguing than to experimentation. Yet in his careful descriptions we sense a broader human pattern, quiet observation, a slow building of knowledge, layer upon layer. But it was in China that the lodestone would begin to reveal its more directional secrets. As early as the 4th century BCE, Chinese texts mention magnetized needles and stones that aligned themselves with the cardinal directions. The philosopher Wang Chong, writing in the 1st century CE, referred to the attractive power of the south-pointing needle, though his focus was more metaphysical than practical. Still, there it was, a thread, slender and almost unnoticed, pointing steadily toward the compass's future. It is worth pausing here for a moment to appreciate the stillness of this stage in the story. There are no maps being drawn yet, no ships altering course across unknown seas, only scholars and craftspeople quietly passing stones from hand to hand, balancing slivers of metal on reeds or silk threads, noticing that again and again something unseen tugs in the same direction. No one knew quite why, but they remembered it. They watched, and the knowledge crept forward, not in leaps or flashes, but with the soft persistence of moss growing between paving stones. By the time of the Han Dynasty in China, the quiet tug of magnetism would begin to find purpose, and the needle, at last, would begin to guide more than thought alone. If we continue gently now, into the winding corridors of early Chinese history, we find ourselves amidst a civilization that had long nurtured a deep attentiveness to the rhythms of nature. From the drifting clouds and circling stars to the quiet stirrings of wind and water. Within this richly observant world, the curious behavior of lodestone found its earliest practical applications. Not in maritime voyages or grand expeditions, but in divination and the subtle art of geomancy. By the time of the Warring States period, sometime between the 5th and 3rd centuries BCE, Chinese scholars had begun to explore the peculiar properties of magnetism in more intentional ways. Among these early observers were the followers of Taoist thought, whose philosophy prized harmony with the unseen forces of the natural world. The notion that a stone could exert an invisible pull aligned rather naturally with Taoist principles: soft influence, quiet direction, the flow of unseen energies. In such an intellectual climate, the lodestone was less a tool than a sign, something to be read and interpreted, much like the movements of clouds or the curling of incense smoke. The earliest known device resembling a compass in function was not a needle, but a spoon. A divination instrument, often referred to as the south-pointing spoon, was carved from lodestone itself. It was shaped into the likeness of a ladle, with a smooth rounded bowl and a thin tapering handle. This spoon was then placed upon a flat bronze plate, carefully polished and inscribed with directional markings. When allowed to settle freely, the spoon would slowly rotate, aligning itself so that its handle consistently pointed south. There was, to this early practice, a certain ceremony. The movement was observed in silence, the result not hurried or questioned, but received with a kind of reverent curiosity. It was used in the art of feng shui, the quiet study of spatial harmony. Houses, tombs, and cities were planned not on whim, but according to the gentle guidance of the landscape and, increasingly, the subtle pull of magnetism. The spoon, lying still, then slowly turning of its own accord, was not yet a scientific instrument. It was a quiet whisper of balance, a guide to placing one's life in tune with the earth's breath. It is worth noting that these early devices did not point north, as our modern compasses do, but south, reflecting a cultural orientation in Chinese cosmology where the emperor, the sun, and heavenly forces were associated with the southern quarter. North was the domain of darkness and cold, the space from which winter descended. South, in contrast, was warmth and order. Thus, the lodestone's alignment, though the same in effect, was read and revered from a different perspective. As the centuries unfolded into the Han Dynasty, which ruled from 206 BCE to 220 CE, these magnetic practices became more refined. Texts such as the Lunheng, penned by the philosopher Wang Chong, made passing reference to the ability of magnetized iron to point to the south when suspended or balanced. His tone, dry and questioning, was one of the first to suggest an observational rather than spiritual approach to magnetism, though the full leap into technical application remained for the time being gently dormant. The compass had not yet left the quiet world of scholars and mystics, but it was beginning to shift. Slowly, methodically, the Chinese began to experiment with ways of transferring the magnetic properties of lodestone to other materials. They discovered, likely through careful trial and error, that a sliver of iron could be magnetized by stroking it with a lodestone, infusing the mundane with this directional gift. This subtle refinement opened new possibilities. Metal could be shaped more finely than stone, balanced more delicately, and suspended more freely. By the time we approach the close of the Han period, one begins to sense a gentle turning. The magnetic needle, suspended on silk thread or placed upon a reed floating in a bowl of water, begins to appear in written accounts. These floating devices offered a degree of movement and stability that earlier spoon models lacked. Water, after all, absorbs vibration. It allows for steadier motion, a more consistent pointing. And though these devices were still chiefly used in geomantic contexts, the principle of directional alignment had now quietly taken a new, more practical shape. The world around them was changing. Trade routes were extending. The Silk Road, in its many branching paths, connected China to lands far westward, Persia, Arabia, and eventually the Mediterranean basin. With goods came ideas, and with ideas, slow transformations. Though still centuries away, the compass's future role in navigation was quietly being prepared by these floating slivers and thoughtful experiments, tucked away in the studies and temples of early Chinese thinkers. No great leap announced this transition. There was no moment of sudden revelation. Rather, it was a soft unfolding. an accumulation of quiet observations of the kind one might make while sipping tea and watching a sliver of metal drift lazily upon a bowl's surface. That was the nature of this chapter in the compass's story. Not loud, not fast, but steady, deliberate, and, above all, patient. And in that patience lay the seed of something enduring. For though the spoon and the floating needle were humble things, their influence was destined to drift far beyond the quiet chambers of Chinese geomancers. The earth was whispering, gently nudging the hand of humanity, and someone at last had begun to listen. Let us now continue, easing further into the days of the Han Dynasty, a period of consolidation and slow refinement, where the compass, still modest in appearance and purpose, began its quiet transition from the mystical into the practical. While its early role had been nestled firmly within the folds of geomancy and philosophical musing, the Han period offered a subtle shift, one not heralded by fanfare or proclamation, but visible in the gentle ways knowledge found new hands and new uses. The Han court, rooted in ritual and order, placed a deep emphasis on structure, social, cosmic, and environmental. Harmony between human endeavor and the natural world was not an abstract ideal, but a guiding principle, visible in the careful placement of buildings, the orientation of tombs, and the slow, seasonal rhythm of agriculture. Within this context, tools that aided alignment, both symbolic and literal, were afforded respect. Thus, the magnetized spoon and needle continued to play their role in these spatial concerns, but more quietly, beyond the formalities of divination, they began to enter the realm of earthly guidance. It was in overland travel rather than maritime pursuits that the early practical use of the compass is thought to have emerged during this period. China's vastness presented challenges that were not just geographical, but deeply environmental. Mountains and deserts, thick forests and wide river-bound plains. The Silk Road, a loose network of trade routes spanning thousands of miles, was being gently formalized by both state and merchant interests. While local guides and celestial observation remained dominant methods of orientation, there were accounts, sparse and sometimes ambiguous, of compass-like instruments being used to aid navigation, particularly across regions where the stars were obscured by weather or where familiar landmarks gave way to shifting sands. The water compass, consisting of a magnetized needle floated upon a piece of reed or cork placed within a shallow bowl, proved particularly effective in these terrestrial contexts. It could be easily packed and carried, it required no elaborate construction, and it responded consistently, unaffected by the shadows of cloud or the movements of sun. Though we have no surviving artifacts from this exact period that confirm its use in overland caravans, later writings, particularly those compiled during the Song Dynasty, refer back to these earlier instruments and their perceived utility for travel. It's important here to resist the urge to imagine dramatic scenes. The compass did not revolutionize travel overnight. Merchants still relied on seasoned guides. Caravans still traced ancient paths etched by memory and repetition. But the quiet presence of a directional tool capable of offering a modest sense of orientation in the absence of sun or known markers would have been a welcome reassurance. Not a replacement for wisdom, but a companion to it. In official Han documentation, there is little explicit mention of the compass as a navigational device. This silence, rather than indicating absence, may suggest its role was seen as minor or perhaps too mundane for chronicling. Han scholars often reserve their ink for affairs of court, ritual, and astronomy, subjects more grand than the slow, dusty progress of trade caravans. And yet, in the margins of society, among those who moved silk and salt, herbs and ceramics, we may imagine the soft glint of a magnetized needle being set afloat, not with ceremony, but with habitual care. There is also the matter of the Han military. Their campaigns, particularly into the western regions and across the steppes, required the careful movement of large numbers of troops and supplies. Though largely dependent on scouts and local knowledge, it is conceivable, though speculative, that the principles of magnetic direction, if not the actual instruments, were applied in subtle ways to improve orientation. Again, not as a primary method, but as a quiet support. Beyond the compass itself, the Han period is notable for its general approach to technology, pragmatic, incremental, and largely free from spectacle. Theirs was a culture that refined rather than reinvented, that polished rather than proclaimed. The same sensibility that produced the enduring beauty of Han ceramics and the precise engineering of their seismographs is reflected in the compass's gradual evolution, a tool honed by patience rather than passion. As we draw this chapter slowly to a close, we find ourselves not in the presence of bold invention or discovery, but in the company of a soft, thoughtful curiosity. The compass in Han China was still, in many ways, a quiet instrument, a reed upon water, a spoon upon bronze, observed more often than relied upon, respected more than revered, and yet in that stillness it found its strength. For the compass was never about force. It did not command or compel. It simply pointed, gently, unfailingly, and in a world of shifting skies and uncertain roads, that gentle consistency held its own kind of power, quiet, enduring, and always just enough. As the centuries drifted on, with dynasties rising and ebbing like the tide, the story of the compass moved softly into the Tang Dynasty, an era that unfolded from 618 to 907 CE. It was a time of cultural flourishing and far-reaching curiosity, when poetry and painting shared quiet corridors with astronomy and invention, and when the delicate knowledge of magnetism, cultivated through earlier generations, began to find more tangible expression. The Tang period is often remembered for its vivid cultural accomplishments, but it was also a time of renewed scientific attention. Scholars of the Tang court, influenced both by Taoist naturalism and Confucian order, continued to observe the natural world with a blend of reverence and method. They looked upward, tracking celestial bodies with increasingly complex instruments, and they looked inward, seeking harmony through careful rituals. Somewhere in between, quietly present yet seldom celebrated, was the magnetized needle. Though the compass did not yet claim a prominent place in maritime navigation, its principle was increasingly understood, and its design slowly refined. The floating needle, balanced upon a sliver of bamboo or cork in a bowl of water, continued to be used in geomantic practice. Yet it began in subtle ways to shift beyond these sacred confines. It became a teaching tool in certain scholarly settings, an example of unseen forces at work. Teachers would demonstrate its steady turning to students, not as magic, but as nature. It was no longer a novelty, but a known thing, respected for its reliability, its calm persistence. Tang-era texts speak occasionally of devices that sound remarkably close to practical compasses. While still bound in description to geomancy and cosmology, some records suggest that the magnetized needle may have been used to aid direction in unfamiliar territories. Travelers, particularly those involved in overland trade, faced the quiet challenge of traversing vast and changeable landscapes. The idea of carrying with them a simple tool that responded to the Earth's unseen pulse was becoming less ritual and more routine. This was also a time of increasing international contact. The Silk Road, while not a single road in the literal sense, had become a vibrant network of routes that carried more than goods. Ideas, customs, languages, and technologies passed quietly from hand to hand. The Tang capital of Chang'an, one of the world's great cities at the time, thrummed with diversity. Merchants from Central Asia, scholars from Persia, monks from India, all contributed to a slow exchange of knowledge. Within this cultural ebb and flow, the concept of the magnetic needle began its patient westward journey. We have no record of a single moment, a specific transaction in which the compass was handed from one civilization to another. But from the Tang period onward, evidence begins to surface in Islamic and later European writings that suggests an awareness, however dim, of magnetic properties being used to determine direction. It may have been a whisper at first, an idea carried not in books but in conversation, in idle demonstration, in the quiet trust that one traveller places in another. Back within China, the Tang Dynasty also saw an increase in maritime activity. While the compass had not yet become a standard tool aboard ships, Chinese junks were venturing further along the coastline, carrying porcelain, silk, and tea to neighbouring regions. These coastal journeys, though generally reliant on sighting land and celestial cues, would have benefited from any tool that offered steadier orientation, particularly in overcast conditions or unfamiliar waters. Whether or not the compass was formally adopted during these sea journeys remains uncertain, but the growing knowledge of its function placed it close at hand. It was not yet the mariner's friend it would one day become. It remained a quiet assistant, still primarily the domain of scholars and those who dealt in the structure of space, both physical and symbolic. But as with many tools of great significance, its transformation did not occur in moments, but in moods, in a slow shift of purpose, as its steady pointing gained new meanings, new uses. Among the more poetic accounts of the period, there is reference to the needle as a south governor, or south pointer, an evocative phrase that imbues the device with a sense of quiet authority. It does not demand nor insist. It simply governs by example, always turning to the same point, always offering calm guidance. The name reflects a worldview in which direction itself is not merely physical but moral, in which knowing where one stands and where one is headed forms part of one's place in the greater order of things. And so, through the long, contemplative years of the Tang Dynasty, the compass continued its soft work. It did not yet guide ships across open seas, nor did it chart maps in any formal way, but it was becoming part of the fabric of understanding, woven into the broader cloth of natural philosophy, spatial awareness, and quiet ingenuity. Its greatest moments still lay ahead, tucked within future voyages and future hands. But here, in the measured rhythms of Tang thought and Tang craft, it found a new level of readiness. It had shifted from the sacred to the studied, from the ceremonial to the quietly practical. And in that shift, the compass took another step on its long journey, from a stone with a strange attraction to a tool that would help humanity know where it stood and where it might go, even in the gentlest dark. And so the compass continued its quiet arc across time and space, slipping gently from the refined studies of Tang China into the scholarly and mercantile circles of the Islamic world. There was no grand unveiling, no singular moment when East handed over to West. Instead, as was often the way with early knowledge, it passed slowly, carried in trade caravans, observed in ports, noted in quiet moments of dialogue between scholars who shared not language, but wonder. By the 9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate had established itself as a flourishing centre of learning and exchange. From its heart in Baghdad, knowledge was gathered and translated with a patience that mirrored the compass's own gentle constancy. Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese texts were studied, copied, and discussed within the hushed halls of observatories and libraries. It is within this atmosphere of contemplative curiosity that the principles of magnetism began to take root once more, reinterpreted, recontextualized, and slowly integrated into Islamic scientific thought. The earliest references to magnetic phenomena in the Islamic world appear in works of natural philosophy, where lodestone was noted for its power to attract iron, and sometimes used in demonstrations of natural law. Writers such as Al-Kindi and Al-Razi recorded these properties in terms more observational than practical, continuing a long tradition of cataloguing without immediate application. But the needle, it seems, had begun to move, not only across bowls of water, but through the pages of scholarship. It was in the 10th and 11th centuries that we begin to see more direct accounts of magnetism in navigational contexts. In particular, the Persian polymath al-Biruni, writing in the early 11th century, described the attractive properties of lodestone and its influence on iron. He noted the alignment of magnetized materials, observing that a rubbed iron needle, when suspended freely, would turn consistently toward the same direction, an understanding that echoes earlier Chinese insights, now quietly mirrored on distant parchment. Al-Biruni's work, though largely theoretical, reflected a broader cultural readiness to accept and explore the compass's potential. The Islamic world was by then deeply connected by sea, through the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the wider Indian Ocean network that linked East Africa to India and beyond. Arab sailors, renowned for their keen knowledge of stars and winds, were not in need of the compass in calm or familiar waters. But as trade expanded and journeys lengthened, tools that could supplement celestial navigation became quietly valuable. There are suggestions in nautical texts and travel accounts of the 12th century that mariners operating in the Indian Ocean may have begun using magnetized needles to aid direction during overcast conditions. These needles, floated in small bowls or suspended within wooden frames, offered a fallback, a subtle safeguard in times when cloud or storm obscured the stars. They were not yet standard and not always named, but the presence of such tools began to spread gently across coasts and cultures. The Mediterranean, too, was beginning to feel the compass's subtle influence. Islamic sailors navigating the complex waters between North Africa, Sicily, and the Levant faced changing winds and busy ports. Though still relying primarily on sun and stars, the idea of a device that could indicate direction in darkness or fog must have held quiet appeal. Whether learned from Eastern texts, coastal exchange, or first-hand demonstration, the knowledge of the directional needle began to trickle into seafaring practice. The linguistic traces of this journey are telling. The Arabic word for compass, al-Qibla, originally referred to direction toward Mecca, reflecting the compass's early use in religious practice. Before it was a navigational tool, the compass in the Islamic world found a place in worship, used by scholars and travelers alike to determine the direction of prayer. This sacred application may have contributed to the compass's early acceptance, lending it a moral clarity before it took on the practicalities of maritime trade. From sacred orientation to sea-borne direction, the compass moved gently, without disruption or display. It became a quiet companion to other tools, astrolabes, maps, celestial charts, each offering a piece of the navigational puzzle. And in the hands of Islamic scholars, the needle's turning was not merely accepted but explored, tested, and folded into a broader conversation about nature and movement. Though we do not have detailed diagrams from this period, the knowledge was there, resting quietly in texts and practices that would later inform European adoption. In places like Cairo, Cordoba, and Damascus, students of the stars were beginning to understand that the earth itself offered guidance, not only through the heavens above, but through the subtle pull of magnetism below. Thus, the compass found its place in the intellectual and practical life of the Islamic world, not as a revolutionary force, but as a gentle addition. It did not replace the wisdom of the stars, nor the skill of seasoned sailors. But in moments of uncertainty, in the stillness of early dawn, or under the dense grey of coastal mist, it provided a silent suggestion, a whispered assurance. And so, onward it moved again. The compass, with no voice of its own, continued its long journey, through translations, through ports, through the quiet faith of those who trusted its pull, toward the western edge of the Mediterranean, where European mariners, curious and cautious, would soon begin to turn their eyes and their vessels toward its subtle guidance. As we drift now into the cloistered halls and wind-swept ports of medieval Europe, we find a world cautiously emerging from a long season of fragmentation. The Roman Empire's memory lingered in stone and scripture, but political borders had shifted, and knowledge, fragmented, retranslated, half-remembered, moved slowly. Yet even in this dim and often disrupted landscape, curiosity endured. Monasteries guarded ancient texts. Craftsmen honed their trades. Pilgrims and merchants travelled ever further, and in this quiet return to movement, the compass quietly arrived. Its journey into Europe was neither direct nor well documented. Like many instruments of ancient origin, it slipped in almost unnoticed, likely through the trading cities of the Mediterranean. Venice and Genoa, deeply connected with the Islamic world, acted as thresholds between East and West. There, among spices, silks, and stories, the notion of a directional needle may first have been observed by European eyes. By the late 12th century, written evidence begins to surface. The English philosopher Alexander Neckham, writing around 1190, makes what is perhaps the earliest recorded mention of the compass in European literature. In a passage, almost offhand in its tone, he notes that seamen carry a needle touched by the magnet, which swings upon a pivot and points to the north. There is no fanfare, no marvelling, just a plain description of a tool already in use. From this, one may gather that the compass had begun to integrate into maritime practice before it had yet captured the attention of scholars or chroniclers. It was not at first a subject of study. It was simply useful, particularly in the fog-prone and unpredictable waters of the North Sea and English Channel. Sailors had long relied on the stars, sun, and familiar coasts. But in the shadowed moments when land was lost to mist and the heavens cloaked in grey, a floating needle offered a modest, reassuring hand. These early European compasses were simple affairs. A magnetized needle might be floated in a bowl, much like in the Chinese tradition, or balanced upon a small spindle. Over time, a dry compass emerged, where the needle was affixed to a card marked with directional points and placed within a housing that allowed it to spin freely. This refinement likely came through gradual innovation among Mediterranean mariners, seeking sturdier forms for the open sea. The symbolism of the compass began to grow too. In a world shaped by Christian belief and a yearning for divine order, the notion of an instrument that consistently pointed north, toward the heavens, toward certainty, found metaphorical weight. It was not merely a tool, but a reminder of constancy, of divine guidance, of the possibility of direction in a world often marked by uncertainty. Still, the compass remained a mariner's companion, not yet a scholar's focus. Universities of the 13th century, though deeply engaged with Aristotelian logic and celestial mechanics, paid little attention to terrestrial magnetism. But among ship captains and coastal traders, its value was becoming known. Ports along the Atlantic and Mediterranean began to see small, hand-held compasses appear among navigational kits. They were passed between sailors, made by local craftsmen, refined by practice rather than theory. In the 13th century, the Italian poet and seaman Guido Guinizelli penned a quiet reference to the compass in his verse, likening its steady turning to the longing of the soul for its source. Such imagery, tender and unforced, speaks to the quiet wonder the device had begun to inspire. It was no longer merely helpful, it was quietly beautiful. By the time we reached the close of the century, the compass had found its way into a growing body of practical knowledge. Sailors began keeping portolan charts, coastal maps marked not just with place names, but with compass lines radiating outward like sunbursts. These charts, designed for use with a magnetic needle, allowed more precise navigation along familiar coasts. They did not yet map the open sea, but they offered order within known bounds. In cities like Marseille, Barcelona, and Pisa, compass makers plied their craft. Often working in small workshops, these artisans shaped delicate needles, mounted them upon cards, and housed them in simple wooden cases. Some were plain, others more ornate, with cardinal directions painted in soft hues. They were sold to captains and traders, who slipped them into their sea chests alongside maps and logs. There is something almost domestic in these tools, small, handheld, familiar. A quiet presence in the unpredictable world of wind and wave. It is worth noting that this spread of compass use occurred without much theoretical understanding. Magnetism remained a mystery. The needle's turning was accepted, but not explained. The Earth's magnetic field, the idea of poles, of declination and inclination, these lay centuries ahead. And yet, absence of theory did not prevent trust. The needle was seen to work. That was enough. And so, in the quiet way of so many practical tools, the compass moved deeper into the rhythms of daily life. It did not announce itself with great discovery. It was not tied to a single inventor or flash of brilliance. Rather, it crept in, one ship at a time, one journey at a time, pointing its silent finger through the mists of medieval Europe. As ships grew bolder and coastlines gave way to open sea, that finger would come to mean more than anyone yet understood. But for now, in these earliest centuries of European contact with magnetism, it was simply a companion, not loud, not proud, just steady and always pointing. Let us drift now into the swelling waves and salted winds of the 15th and 16th centuries, a time often called the Age of Exploration, though from our quiet vantage here, it feels more like the age of movement, of slow realization, and of a growing desire to know what lay beyond the edge of the map. It is within this age, as ships grew in size and ambition, that the compass finally found its central role. Not as a marvel, nor as a curiosity, but as a trusted, almost invisible part of the mariner's craft. By this time, the compass was no longer a newcomer to European seafaring. It had been in use for over 2 centuries, gradually refined by trial, habit, and the delicate work of countless hands. It had become a regular fixture aboard vessels of every sort, from the small trading cogs that hugged the coastlines of the North Sea, to the larger carracks and caravels that began to nose outward, away from land and into the open Atlantic. As European powers, Portugal, Spain, and later England, France, and the Netherlands, turned their attention to exploration and trade beyond the known world, the compass was quietly ready. It was not the only tool in their chests, Astrolabes, cross-staffs, and quadrant instruments helped sailors measure the height of the sun and stars. Charts became more elaborate, and knowledge of currents and wind patterns more systematized. But through all of this, the compass remained the one instrument that never required the sky. It worked in fog, in darkness, in the hush of pre-dawn hours. It simply pointed without need of calculation or interpretation. The classic design of the period's maritime compass was simple yet effective. A magnetized needle was fixed to a card bearing the compass rose, a circle marked with the cardinal points and their intermediaries, often in ornate flowing script. This card was mounted on a pivot within a box, and the whole unit was suspended within gimbals to remain level even as the ship rocked. The compass was often housed near the helm within a binnacle, a wooden stand that also contained candles or lamps for nighttime use. Sailors of the age knew that the compass did not point exactly to true north. The concept of magnetic declination, that the needle's direction varied depending on one's position on the globe, was not yet fully understood, but it was noticed. Mariners learned through experience to compensate, to adjust. Their knowledge was more practical than theoretical, shaped by habit, and shared among crews in low murmurs rather than written in books. Still, they trusted the needle. When all else failed, it remained. Portuguese explorers, among the first to venture far beyond familiar waters, used the compass extensively as they edged their way down the western coast of Africa. Each voyage was a kind of rehearsal, a cautious pressing outward, often sailing far out to sea to catch favourable winds before turning back toward land. The compass allowed these navigators to maintain a steady course in open water and, more importantly, to record the headings they had taken, allowing others to follow. By the time Vasco da Gama reached the Indian Ocean and Columbus crossed the Atlantic, the compass had become indispensable. Not because it guaranteed safety or accuracy, storms still came and many ships were still lost, but because it offered a kind of quiet stability in an otherwise shifting world. It was perhaps the one instrument on board that always behaved predictably. Within the growing science of navigation, the compass also inspired more systematic record-keeping. Ships' logs began to include compass headings at regular intervals. Dead reckoning, the process of estimating one's position based on speed, time, and direction, depended heavily on a reliable sense of bearing. The compass, in this context, was not merely a pointer. It was part of a growing framework for understanding place, distance, and movement across vast, featureless waters. Even as ships began to cross entire oceans, the compass remained essentially unchanged. Its value lay in its simplicity. The same quiet pull that had fascinated Chinese scholars 1,000 years before now guided European sailors across the Atlantic and into the Pacific. The needle, floating silently over a pivot, made no sound. It gave no warning. It simply turned. In coastal towns and shipyards, compass making became a specialized trade. Artisans crafted the compass cards by hand, often decorating them with elaborate designs, sunbursts, fleur-de-lis, and occasionally the image of a wind-blown face to mark east. The north point was usually denoted by a large N, or, in honor of its supposed invention, sometimes with a small magnetic stone or a red mark. These compasses were not mass-produced, but made with care, often adjusted for local magnetic conditions through a process of trial and quiet refinement. Though widely used, the compass still carried a trace of mystery. Few understood why it worked. The Earth's magnetic field would not be formally described until the 17th century. For now, sailors accepted it as they accepted the wind and tide, as part of the sea's strange order. Some still attributed its power to celestial influence, to divine guidance, or to the hidden properties of the earth itself. And so, it sailed on. The compass, in these centuries of discovery and trade, did not demand attention. It was not the subject of poems, not often sketched in journals or depicted in paintings, but it was always there, fixed near the helm, lit by flickering lamp, quietly aligning itself with the deep, invisible forces of the planet. As men dreamed of gold and spices, of new lands and distant peoples, the compass offered only one promise, that north would always be north. It did not guarantee safe passage, it did not whisper of storms to come, but it pointed, softly, always. And in that single gesture, repeated again and again on 1,000 decks beneath 1,000 skies, it changed the world. Let us now follow the thread a little further, into the still air of a ship's cabin, or perhaps the gentle creak of timbers as a vessel sits just beyond the sight of land. Here, in the soft glow of a hanging lamp, we find the dry compass, an evolution quiet in its appearance, yet deeply significant in how it shaped the way mariners moved across water. It was not an invention that startled or disrupted, but rather one that settled into the routines of sailors with the calm confidence of a tool that simply worked. The term dry compass refers to a subtle refinement of earlier floating models. Rather than suspending the needle in water where it might bob or drift with the ship's motion, the dry compass placed the magnetized needle upon a vertical pivot, allowing it to spin freely in the air. This pivot was housed within a protective casing, often a circular box of wood or brass, whose interior bore the compass card, marked with the familiar rows of directions. Suspended in this quiet chamber, the needle turned in response to the Earth's magnetic field, unencumbered by fluid resistance or external vibrations. This design emerged gradually, shaped more by experience than by design theory. Sailors needed instruments that could function reliably aboard moving ships, where spills were common and surfaces seldom remained level. The dry compass, especially when mounted within gimbals, metal rings that kept the instrument level despite the ship's movement, offered a stability that floating models could not. No longer would the mariner need to still the surface of water before taking a bearing. The dry compass responded instantly with its steady, whispering turn. By the late 15th century, this form of compass had become standard equipment aboard larger vessels, especially those making long voyages. It was not used in isolation, of course. Navigation still relied heavily on the stars, on the sun, and on the logline and sand glass to measure speed and time. But the compass provided the steady backbone of direction, a fixed reference point amid the shifting uncertainties of sea travel. Its most profound use came in the practice of dead reckoning, where a ship's current position was estimated based on a known starting point, the speed of travel, the time elapsed, and the compass heading. This method allowed navigators to maintain a mental or written record of their voyage, even when landmarks disappeared and the sky remained closed. It was far from perfect, but it was consistent, and that, at sea, was a precious thing. With the compass now housed in a dry, durable casing, it also became more adaptable. It could be taken below deck, consulted in poor weather, and more easily protected from the elements. Some versions were fitted with small glass windows, allowing the needle to be read without exposing it to wind or spray. Others included illumination, candles, oil lamps, and later small reflective surfaces to allow readings at night. Mariners grew used to the sight of the dry compass mounted near the helm, often within arm's reach of the helmsman. Its presence was constant, its motion familiar. One could almost forget it was there until the stars were hidden or the coastlines lost, And then, like a quiet friend, it would be consulted once again. There was comfort in the way the needle turned, never rushed, always returning to its quiet point. In shipyards and workshops, compass makers refined their craft. The compass card, once hand-drawn and painted, became more uniform. North was commonly marked with a fleur-de-lis, while east often bore a cross, symbolizing the direction of Jerusalem in early Christian mapping. These cards were carefully balanced, mounted upon low-friction pivots, and adjusted for local variations. Makers began to note that different locations produced slightly different readings. Early recognition of magnetic declination, even if the cause was not yet understood. The spread of the dry compass coincided with the age of growing maritime empires. As European nations established trading posts, colonies, and shipping routes across oceans, the compass became part of a larger navigational culture. It was packed into sea chests and passed down through generations of sailors. It travelled from Lisbon to Goa, from Amsterdam to Jakarta, from Plymouth to the Caribbean. It bore no flag, yet served every nation. It asked no allegiance, offered no opinion. It simply pointed. There was, during this period, a growing fascination with the compass in the broader culture as well. Writers and poets began to use it as metaphor, speaking of moral direction, of constancy in love or faith. The needle's steady turning became symbolic, an image of the soul's quiet pull toward truth, or of the longing to return home. It found its way into sermons and stories, into quiet reflections penned by travellers far from familiar shores. And still, amid all these meanings and uses, the compass remained a humble tool. It did not proclaim its value. It had no voice. But in the long silences of open sea, when no sail broke the horizon and no land was visible in any direction, it was there, a small circle of metal and wood, resting in its cradle, turning gently toward a direction that could not be seen, only trusted. For the sailor, it was enough. The compass did not need to explain itself. It worked, and in a world shaped by wind, wave, and wandering, that small certainty meant everything. As we now step softly into the thoughtful dawn of the Renaissance, we find a Europe that is slowly, almost cautiously, beginning to turn its gaze inward. The age of exploration had shown what the world contained, its coasts, its contours, its wealth, but now came a quiet shift of focus toward the principles behind movement, matter, and the silent forces that seem to shape nature itself. In this setting of careful observation and philosophical wonder, the compass, so long a mariner's companion, began at last to draw the attention of scholars. The 16th century, particularly, brought forth a steady trickle of writing on magnetism. These were not works of speculation alone, nor were they driven by practical necessity. They emerged from a gentle, growing desire to understand, to ask why the compass needle turned, and what precisely it was responding to. This curiosity did not explode overnight. Like the needle's own motion, it came slowly, with a kind of measured inevitability. Among the earliest voices in this new inquiry was the English physician and natural philosopher William Gilbert. His quiet, thorough work, De Magnete, published in 1600, stands as one of the first comprehensive studies of magnetism and the Earth's magnetic properties. Gilbert did not stumble upon his insights in haste. He spent years observing, experimenting, and reflecting. He rubbed iron rods with lodestone. He suspended needles, floated them on cork, and constructed a model Earth, his Terrella, to test magnetic behavior. What Gilbert discovered and gently explained in his careful Latin prose was that the earth itself behaved like a giant magnet. The compass needle did not point north because of some distant lodestone mountain or divine impulse, but because it was responding to the magnetic field generated by the planet itself. This insight, simple in its phrasing, marked a turning point. It shifted the compass from the realm of mystery into the domain of natural law. Yet even as Gilbert offered this quiet revolution in understanding, he retained a reverence for the compass's long legacy. He did not belittle its earlier uses, nor seek to erase the centuries of practical knowledge. Rather, he built upon them, affirming what mariners had long known through observation, and folding their wisdom into a broader, more unified view of nature. Others followed. European scholars throughout the 17th century began to replicate and refine Gilbert's experiments. They studied the effects of heating on magnetized metals, the variation of magnetic strength at different latitudes, and the curious shifting angle at which a needle tilted into the earth, known as magnetic inclination. These findings emerged not as dramatic declarations but as quiet observations, shared in letters, small treatises, and the gatherings of learned societies. Magnetism, now that it had found a place in scientific discourse, began to be considered alongside gravity, light, and heat as one of the fundamental properties of the natural world. It remained somewhat elusive, not fully understood, but it had earned its place in the growing constellation of forces that shaped physical reality. The compass, meanwhile, changed little in form. Its dry gimbal design remained in use aboard ships, its face increasingly standardized, its accuracy slowly improved through better balancing and careful adjustment. Makers continued to tune their instruments for local conditions, compensating for declination when possible, and marking their cards with clearer, more precise intervals. Yet for all this, the compass remained a quiet presence. It was not a showpiece, it was a companion. In the academies and salons of Renaissance Europe, the compass was sometimes brought out as a demonstration, shown to students and visitors, its steady turning described as evidence of hidden forces. Children might be invited to see it spin, to place a piece of lodestone nearby and watch the needle shift. Such demonstrations were not dramatic, but they held a quiet wonder. They suggested that the world, even in its stillness, was alive with motion, subtle, invisible, but always present. There were debates, of course. Not all accepted Gilbert's conclusions. Some clung to earlier ideas, that the needle sought the pole star or responded to ethereal winds. Others wondered if celestial bodies might influence its motion, but gradually the scientific consensus began to shift, drawn by the weight of repeated observation and careful reasoning. The compass, once a silent servant of navigation, had become a key to understanding the Earth itself. And yet, in all of this, its role in everyday life remained unchanged. Sailors still consulted it in the hush before dawn. Travellers carried pocket compasses in leather pouches, tucked beside maps and journals. In cities and ports, artisans still made them by hand, with care and precision, their craft passed down through generations. The compass did not demand recognition. It continued, as always, to point. In a world that was learning to question, to test, to measure, the compass offered something gently steadfast. It was, at once, the subject of theory and the tool of practice. It could sit on a scholar's desk or a ship's rail and serve equally well, and perhaps that, more than anything, was its quiet brilliance, that it bridged the abstract and the concrete, the world of thought and the world of action, with a grace as natural as a turning needle. So we leave this chapter not with noise or triumph, but with a sense of calm progression. The compass had revealed one of the Earth's quiet truths. It had become, in the hands of thinkers and sailors alike, a symbol of direction, both literal and philosophical, a silent witness to humanity's search, not only for new lands, but for understanding. As we step softly inland now, away from the salt-tinged breeze and gently creaking timbers of the maritime world, we find the compass quietly making itself useful once more, this time along the dusty tracks, wooded paths, and winding roads of overland travel. It was not a dramatic return. The compass had been present in such journeys before, used sparingly, almost ceremonially, in early Chinese and Islamic contexts. But now, in the gradual unfolding of the modern era, it began to find a quieter, more routine role in the movements of merchants, explorers, surveyors, and the quietly curious. The use of the compass in overland travel emerged most gently during the 16th and 17th centuries, alongside the broader increase in map-making, surveying, and structured travel across Europe and beyond. Roads were being improved. Borders, though still fluid, were being more carefully defined, and the notion of travelling with purpose, of reaching a destination not merely by memory or the guidance of locals, but by recorded direction, was beginning to take shape. Travellers, especially those venturing beyond well-trodden routes, found in the compass a quiet reassurance. When familiar landmarks faded behind them and the path ahead grew uncertain, a small needle's steady point offered a moment of orientation. These compasses were not the large, gimbaled instruments of ocean-going ships. They were pocket-sized, often circular, encased in brass or wood, and closed with a protective lid that snapped shut with a soft click. Carried in satchels or tucked into coat pockets, they became part of the modest traveller's kit, alongside notebooks, flint, and perhaps a rolled map bound with twine. For explorers moving into unfamiliar territories, be it the interior of the Americas, the wooded expanses of Eastern Europe, or the deserts of Africa, the compass became something more than practical. It became symbolic. It stood for progress, for human intention imposed upon the sprawling, often unpredictable landscape. Yet even here, it was never boastful. It remained a quiet tool, used when clouds hid the sun, when paths split without signposts, or when memory faltered. In this period, compass use was often paired with the growing discipline of land surveying. Surveyors needed to record angles and alignments accurately in order to map estates, define property lines, or assist in the construction of roads and canals. While the more precise work relied on instruments like the theodolite and plane table, the compass served as a faithful assistant, giving general bearings and helping to orient larger projects. It was common to see a compass mounted atop a simple surveying staff, the whole unit light enough to be carried across fields and open land. Military use, too, brought the compass further into overland application. Armies on the move required coordination and alignment, especially as formations became more regimented and tactics more complex. Officers were issued compasses not only to guide long marches, but to orient battlefield positions, align artillery, and map terrain for strategic advantage. The Prussian army in particular became known for its emphasis on measurement and order, with compass-guided mapping forming a quiet part of its disciplined approach. In the world of letters and journals, we begin to see more personal references to the compass as a travelling companion. Explorers noted its role in their pathfinding, and amateur naturalists recorded their observations alongside compass headings. In the margins of hand-drawn sketches of trees or distant hills, one might find a small note. Facing north-northeast, the ridge bends eastward after a mile. Such quiet annotations speak to a growing trust in the compass, not as a marvel, but as a modest part of how one understood space. It was also during this period that compasses began to be manufactured in greater numbers, particularly in European centres of trade and learning. Cities like Nuremberg, Paris, and London became known for producing finely made scientific instruments, including compasses of all sizes and types. Some were decorative, engraved with initials or lined with mother of pearl, while others were purely functional. Makers began to calibrate their compasses more carefully, accounting for regional magnetic variation. Some even included small adjustment mechanisms to correct for known errors. Yet, for all these refinements, the essential experience remained unchanged. To hold a compass was to hold a small, silent promise. No matter how thick the forest or featureless the plain, the needle would turn. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it would align itself, and one would know, at least, the way north. From there, with time and care, all other directions might be reasoned out. Children, too, were sometimes introduced to the compass during this time, not as a tool of navigation, but as a curiosity of nature. Schoolmasters would pass it around, allow pupils to see the needle's movement, and explain that it was the earth itself that guided the hand. These quiet demonstrations helped to cultivate an early appreciation for the idea that the world could be known, measured, and gently understood. And so, as carriages rolled through wooded lanes and footpaths traced the ridgelines of hills, the compass went along, not as a leader, but as a quiet advisor. It never demanded attention, but it was always ready. Whether in the hands of a weary traveller, a cautious general, or a curious child, it gave the same gift: orientation. And perhaps that is the heart of its role in overland life. Not simply pointing the way, but offering the traveller a small thread of certainty. In a landscape that could shift with weather, time, or the failings of memory, the compass remained unchanged, a quiet guide, held in the palm, gently turning, patiently waiting. Let us now follow the compass from path to parchment, as it began to shape not only the movements of people across sea and land, but the way those journeys were remembered, recorded, and envisioned. For in the quiet work of cartographers, those steady hands that traced coastlines, drew mountain ranges, and marked the spaces between, one finds the compass again, not as a bold inspiration, but as a quiet presence behind the scenes. It did not draw the maps, but it helped the drawer know where he stood. The compass's influence on cartography became steadily more pronounced from the late Middle Ages onward, as navigators recorded their headings and bearings, and as these logs were compiled into charts, a need arose for consistency in direction. The magnetic compass, with its unwavering pull toward north, offered a fixed frame of reference around which maps could be structured. Thus, the compass did not merely guide the journey, it began to shape the very image of the world. Perhaps the most visible expression of this quiet shaping is found in the Portolan charts of the 13th to 16th centuries. These early nautical maps, hand-drawn on vellum or parchment, were crafted with meticulous care. Radiating from central points, often forming a network of interlocking circles, were compass lines or rhumb lines, indicating consistent bearings from place to place. These were not abstract constructs. They reflected the practical knowledge of sailors drawn from compass-guided navigation. The rhumb lines, usually drawn in red, green, or black ink, gave the charts their characteristic appearance, like a delicate spider's web stretched across the known world. Though beautiful in form, they were entirely functional. A navigator could place his compass upon the chart, align it with the appropriate bearing, and chart a course from one port to another. The lines offered not philosophical orientation, but practical direction. And yet, even in this, the compass introduced a subtle complication. one that would linger quietly for centuries. The direction indicated by a magnetic compass is not true north, but magnetic north, a point that shifts slightly over time due to changes in the Earth's magnetic field. This variation, known as magnetic declination, means that compass readings must be adjusted depending on location and date. Early mapmakers were aware of this discrepancy, though they lacked the theoretical framework to explain it fully. Some tried to correct their charts based on local observation, while others simply accepted the variation as part of the craft. A few drew maps oriented not to true north at all, but to the local magnetic direction, causing confusion when their works were used in other regions. These quiet misalignments, small perhaps, but meaningful, highlight the ongoing interplay between human understanding and natural forces. As the Renaissance progressed, and as Europe's scientific curiosity deepened, more formal efforts were made to study magnetic variation. Observatories began to record the angle between magnetic north and true north in different locations. These data were slowly compiled, and by the 17th century, magnetic charts began to appear. Maps not of land or sea, but of the behavior of the compass itself. These magnetic charts marked isogonic lines, connecting places with equal magnetic declination, and gave mariners the information they needed to correct their bearings. Such charts were not common at first. They were often circulated among naval captains, scholars, and navigational academies rather than the general public. But their creation marked a quiet turning point. It signaled that the compass was no longer seen merely as a tool, but as a phenomenon worthy of its own study. It had moved from the realm of practice into that of theory, and its influence extended not only to movement, but to the measured understanding of the Earth's magnetic character. Meanwhile, cartographers continued their work, gently balancing aesthetics and utility. Compass roses adorned the corners of maps, often with ornate detail, elaborate north points, miniature wind faces, and delicate fleur-de-lis embellishments. These compass roses were not mere decoration. They allowed the user to orient the map according to a compass bearing, anchoring the representation of the world to the subtle pull of magnetism. In land mapping, too, the compass played a growing role. Surveyors relied on compass bearings to record angles and align boundaries. As colonial powers extended their territories, land was divided, catalogued, and mapped using compass-based methods. These efforts, sometimes imposed without regard for local geography or culture, nonetheless bore the mark of the compass's steady influence. Fields were aligned with the cardinal directions. Roads and property lines ran true to bearings. The landscape, over time, was made to conform not to the eye, but to the needle. Yet through all of this, the compass remained humble. It did not seek credit for the maps drawn, the borders marked, or the seas crossed. It gave no speech, wrote no legend. It simply pointed north and allowed others to decide what that meant. In the quiet of a cartographer's chamber, where ink dried slowly and vellum curled at the edges, one might imagine the compass resting nearby, perhaps open on the desk, perhaps closed and still, waiting for its next bearing. It was not the subject of the map, but it was always part of the process, and in that quiet companionship, it shaped the way the world was seen, recorded, and remembered. Now, if we pause and look not to the ships or the maps, nor to the far reaches of exploration, but instead to the workbenches and the small, soot-darkened rooms where tools were shaped by hand, we come to another part of the compass's long, quiet journey. For behind every reliable bearing, every steady turn of the needle, lay the slow, careful work of the compass maker. a craftsperson whose efforts seldom made the histories, but whose hands made the histories possible. Compass making as a trade emerged gently from the broader traditions of metalworking, instrument making, and woodcraft. In the early days, the compass was assembled by those who already had skills in other scientific instruments, makers of astrolabes, sundials, or quadrants. These were artisans, not inventors, and their relationship with the compass was rooted in refinement rather than innovation. The compass did not require reinvention, it simply required careful attention and a respect for subtlety. In workshops across Europe, from London to Lyon, from Nuremberg to Naples, small rooms echoed with the faint rasp of file against brass, the ticking of hands aligning cards, and the quiet patience of makers testing, balancing, adjusting. A compass, though it looked simple, was an instrument of precision. Its usefulness depended not on its appearance, but on the care with which its needle was magnetized, its pivot balanced, and its housing secured. The magnetization of the needle was typically achieved by stroking it with a lodestone or, later, with an artificial magnet made of hardened steel. This had to be done with care. Too much force, and the magnetism would become uneven. Too little, and the needle would fail to align properly. The maker would then mount the needle onto a pivot, often a fine pin of brass or steel, and test its movement within a closed casing. The compass card, usually a small circular piece of paper or vellum, was often hand-drawn, marked with degrees, cardinal points, and sometimes decorative flourishes. These cards were affixed either directly to the needle or to a ring encircling it, depending on the design. The housing, too, was important. It had to allow the needle freedom to turn, but also offer protection from wind, moisture, and sudden jolts. A misaligned case could render the whole device unreliable. As the craft matured, variations in design began to emerge. In France and England, compasses were sometimes enclosed in octagonal or hexagonal wooden boxes, while in Italy, a more rounded style often prevailed. German makers favoured precision and often produced finely engraved brass casings, their markings etched with care and filled with dark wax or ink for contrast. Some compasses included gimbals to keep the needle level at sea, while others were designed for pocket use, slimmer, with lids and catches to keep them closed when not in use. Surveying compasses might be mounted on staffs with sighting vanes or glass-covered faces for easier alignment. Each form responded to a different need, but all shared the same essential heart, a magnetized needle, free to move, drawn gently northward. Compass makers were not scientists in the modern sense, but many were keen observers of nature. They learned through experience how magnetic variation affected performance, and some adjusted their instruments accordingly. They understood that local geology could interfere with readings, and that even nearby iron objects could disturb the needle. Their expertise was practical, passed on through apprenticeship, through demonstration, through long hours spent in quiet rooms filled with tools and dust. The tools of the trade were modest: files, compasses for drawing, small presses, cutting tools, magnets, but the care was unhurried, and the pride taken in a well-balanced needle, in a smoothly turning card, was real and enduring. Many makers marked their instruments with small initials, stamped or engraved, tiny signatures left on the underside of the casing, or beside the cardinal north point. These marks, though easy to overlook, were tokens of trust, quietly saying, "This has been made well, this will serve you." In time, larger workshops began to produce compasses in greater numbers. The Industrial Revolution, still on the horizon during the height of manual compass making, would bring changes in scale and production methods. But for centuries, the compass remained a largely handcrafted object, made slowly, tested patiently, sold quietly. It was not perhaps a trade of wealth or glory, but it was one of quiet satisfaction. To make something that guided others, to create an instrument that helped a sailor reach home, a traveller cross a mountain, a child find north in a garden, was, in its own small way, to participate in every journey it made possible. And so, tucked away behind shops and sail lofts, behind city walls and beside river banks, compass makers shaped their instruments by lamplight. They did not name new lands or cross oceans, but they gave others the means to do so. Their hands touched countless lives, though few ever knew the names of those hands. In the end, it is fitting, for the compass itself asks for no recognition. It works quietly, faithfully, doing what it must. And those who made it shared that same quiet constancy. People who understood that guidance does not need applause, only care and accuracy and a still centre. As we move now into the quieter pages of poetry, philosophy and prose, we find that the compass, so long a tool of craft and practice, had also become something more, something softly metaphorical. For in the turning of its needle, in its quiet devotion to a single direction, thinkers and writers across centuries began to see not only physical guidance, but a reflection of inner steadiness, of moral clarity, and the gentle pull of longing toward one's true course. The compass entered literature not with spectacle, but with a kind of whispered reverence. Its first symbolic appearances were often understated, appearing in travelogues, devotional texts, and philosophical reflections where the language of direction and bearing was already close at hand. Writers, ever alert to the emotional resonance of physical things, saw in the compass a language all its own, a language of alignment, of quiet orientation amid the confusions of life. In Christian writings of the early modern period, the compass was sometimes likened to conscience, a steady inner guide that pointed not to magnetic north, but to spiritual truth. Sermons and tracts spoke of the soul as a compass, its needle trembling yet ever turning toward righteousness. The idea was not new. Humans had long looked for metaphors to describe the experience of moral intuition. But the compass offered something more tangible, an image that moved, pointed, aligned, all without speech or instruction. In poetry, too, the compass found gentle footing. The English metaphysical poet John Donne, in his famous poem, A Valediction, Forbidding Mourning, compared the steadfastness of two lovers to the legs of a compass. One fixed, one roaming, yet always connected, always returning. His verse, crafted in the early 17th century, captures the emotional poise of the compass, a tool of separation and reunion, of motion and rest. This poetic use of the compass, where its form and movement become emblems of love, fidelity, or philosophical balance, continued through the centuries. In the Romantic period, writers such as Wordsworth and Coleridge drew upon the compass's imagery when reflecting on inner journeys, on the need to find direction within oneself amid the shifting landscapes of nature and society. Even in these musings, the compass was never loud. It was always quiet, always measured, a whisper rather than a cry. In philosophical writing, the compass sometimes became a symbol of the search for truth. Enlightenment thinkers, concerned with reason and clarity, found in the compass an apt metaphor for the scientific spirit, an emblem of objectivity, of detachment from fleeting passions. To follow the compass was to trust in method, to move forward with deliberation, guided not by impulse, but by something constant. Yet, in more reflective moods, the compass became something softer, something almost melancholic. Writers facing exile, uncertainty, or change would refer to the compass as a comfort, a companion that remained true when all else seemed to shift. In letters home, In travel diaries and personal journals, the compass was often described not merely as an object, but as a friend, something one could consult not just for location, but for reassurance. And then there is the compass in children's literature and early adventure tales. In stories of exploration and far-off lands, it appears as the tool of the brave, the small ticking talisman that helps a character find their way. Yet even here, it is rarely the hero. It is the helper, the modest guide. Its magic lies not in transformation, but in consistency. In more modern literature, the compass continues to appear, sometimes literally, sometimes abstractly. It is the gift passed from one generation to the next, the heirloom that still works, the object tucked into a drawer, then found again at a moment of decision. Writers use it to speak of orientation, of staying true, of finding one's bearings after a loss or change. In each of these uses, there is a kind of gentleness. The compass is rarely associated with triumph or conquest. Instead, it speaks to the quiet human need for direction, for a sense that, no matter how tangled the path or how dense the fog, there is a way forward, and something, however small, that can point us there. Artists, too, have drawn upon this symbolism. The compass appears in paintings and engravings, sometimes nestled in a sailor's hand, sometimes resting quietly on a desk beside a chart. It is not shown in motion, but in readiness, waiting, offering. And even in the everyday speech of today, the compass remains. We speak of people losing their moral compass, of needing to find one's direction, of being guided by an inner north. These phrases are so common that we forget their origin. But at their heart is the same idea, that direction is not always visible, that sometimes it must be felt, and that the tools which help us orient ourselves need not shout. They need only one point. So the compass lives on, not only in pockets and kits, but in language, in memory, in metaphor, a small, consistent motion, a soft, magnetic whisper, and a promise that we are not entirely without guidance, even when the world seems most uncertain. As we reach the quieter edges of the 19th and 20th centuries, the compass, by now long familiar, long trusted, enters a period of refinement. No longer a novelty, no longer confined to the hands of mariners or explorers, it finds itself adapted and adjusted, shaped by science, industry, and the slow, deliberate march of precision. These were not dramatic reinventions, but careful calibrations, measured improvements made not to transform the compass, but to make it more exact, more stable, and more in harmony with the world it served. By the mid-19th century, the science of magnetism had become well established. The Earth's magnetic field was no longer a mystery. Observatories across the globe recorded magnetic variation, tracking the slow drift of magnetic north and the subtle shifts in local fields. These data, collected over decades, allowed for more accurate mapping, more reliable corrections, and, in turn, more finely tuned compasses. Instrument makers, now often trained engineers rather than artisans, responded with characteristic care. Compass needles were balanced more precisely, adjusted for both horizontal and vertical sensitivity. Damping mechanisms using oil or air were introduced to reduce oscillation, allowing the needle to settle more quickly. Cases were made airtight, sealed against moisture and dust, and fitted with glass covers that resisted fogging and scratching. Every component became more exact, yet the compass retained its familiar form, a circle, a needle, a quiet point. One of the key developments of this period was the liquid-filled compass. First introduced in the late 1800s, it suspended the needle in a clear fluid, typically alcohol or oil, which served two purposes. It damped the needle's motion, allowing it to stabilize more quickly, and it reduced wear on the pivot, prolonging the life of the instrument. These liquid compasses were especially useful in situations involving constant motion, such as aboard ships, aircraft, and vehicles. Their smooth responsiveness became a quiet revelation. The magnetic compass also found itself being reimagined for new contexts. Military use, in particular, demanded robustness, portability, and ease of use. Pocket compasses were issued to soldiers, compact, rugged, and capable of operating in difficult terrain. Some models were fitted with sighting devices, allowing the user to align the compass with a distant object and read the bearing directly. Others included tritium or radium markings for visibility at night, glowing faintly in the dark without the need for external light. In the air, the compass adapted yet again. Aircraft navigation required instruments that could operate reliably at high speed and altitude. The aviation compass was mounted within a stable casing, often gimbaled or card-mounted, and calibrated to account for the magnetic interference caused by the aircraft's metal frame and electrical systems. Pilots learned to interpret these instruments not just as simple direction finders, but as part of a broader navigational array, supported by maps, radio signals, and later, inertial systems. And then came the motorcar. Though not as reliant on direction as a ship or plane, the car brought the compass into everyday motion. Dashboard-mounted compasses became a modest feature in some early touring vehicles, offering a sense of orientation on long country drives or unfamiliar roads. These automotive compasses, like their aerial counterparts, had to contend with the interference of nearby metal and electric currents. Makers compensated with small adjustable magnets built into the casing to counteract these local disturbances. As magnetic interference became better understood, calibration grew more nuanced. Compass users were taught to adjust their instruments depending on where they were and what was nearby. The concept of deviation, errors caused by local magnetic fields, was introduced into standard training. Mariners, pilots, and surveyors alike learned to chart these deviations and apply corrections. The compass was still simple, but using it well had become a quiet science of its own. In the home too, the compass found a place, especially in the early 20th century, when amateur exploration, hiking, and natural science were encouraged as part of healthy education. Scouts and ramblers carried simple compasses alongside field guides and maps, learning to orient themselves not by signs and roads, but by bearing and distance. These compasses, often made of aluminium or lightweight plastic, were unassuming in design. Yet, to the person who used one well, they opened the landscape, and all the while, the compass remained visually unchanged. Its elegance lay in its restraint. It had no need for decoration, though many remained finely made. It asked no attention. It simply responded, as it always had, to the pull of the planet, modified only slightly by the hand of the maker, the calibration of the user, and the quiet environments through which it passed. In the modern workshop, where compasses are assembled not by one pair of hands, but by many, where machinery cuts to tolerances impossible by file alone, the principles remain the same. The needle must balance, the housing must protect, the markings must be clear, visible in day and night, in stillness and in motion. A good compass, even now, is not complex. It is simply right. Digital technology, satellite systems, and GPS have since taken the stage in modern navigation, and yet the compass remains, on wrists, in pockets, in aircraft dashboards and marine panels, not because it is nostalgic, but because it is reliable. It requires no power, no signal, no satellite. It only needs the earth beneath it. So we find ourselves in a world that has grown faster, more connected, more technical. But the compass, refined though it may be, remains what it always was. A steady hand in uncertain places, a soft certainty in a moving world. Its calibration, its adjustment, its balance. These are quiet arts. They do not call for applause, but they do perhaps deserve a moment of recognition. For in a world full of signals and noise, a needle that simply points, untroubled, unhurried, is something still worth trusting. And now we arrive at the final curve in our slow, steady path, the legacy of the compass, not as a marvel of invention nor as a relic of the past, but as a quiet presence that endures. It remains in drawers and glove compartments, in backpacks and on watch straps. It rests beneath dashboards and inside aircraft cockpits. It lies in museum cases, certainly, but also in pockets, still used, still trusted. And in this quiet persistence lies its truest legacy. The compass has never needed attention. It does not ask to be seen. Yet for more than 1,000 years, it has shaped the way humans move through the world. Not with command, not with noise, but with a single soft assurance, this way. From the floating spoon of ancient China to the dry box aboard an English brig, from the diviner's hand in a windswept field to the mariner tracing his course across the Southern Ocean, the compass has always offered a kind of calm. Not just direction, but confidence. It does not know where one is going, but it knows where north lies. And from that, everything else can follow. In times of certainty, the compass is almost forgotten. When the sky is clear and landmarks are visible, it rests quietly. But when the stars disappear, when the path is unfamiliar, it comes to life. Still silently, still without urgency, but with a firm and unwavering gesture. It becomes what it was always meant to be, a companion in the unknown. Even now, when satellite systems wrap the globe in invisible webs of signal and speed, the compass endures. Digital compasses may flicker on screens. Phones may carry tiny magnetometers that adjust and recalibrate with a tap. Yet the principle remains untouched. The earth turns, and the compass responds. A dialogue of poles and fields, happening in real time, needing no wires, no light, no permission. Its influence also endures in how we speak and think. To lose one's bearings is more than a matter of navigation. It is to lose orientation, meaning, direction. A moral compass is not made of metal or marked in degrees, but it serves much the same function. It is the thing that helps us move through uncertainty with some small inner clarity. Artists and architects, too, still draw inspiration from the compass. It appears in mandalas, in cathedral floors, in the quiet geometry of maps and monuments. The compass rose, once etched into the corners of parchment sea charts, continues to appear in logos, emblems, and designs, reminding us that direction, like purpose, can be both elegant and essential. For children, the compass remains a tool of first adventures. To hold one for the first time, to see the needle quiver and settle, to learn that north is not just an idea, but a place, is to experience something very old and very gentle. It is a first lesson in trust, in unseen forces, in quiet truths. And so the compass continues, quietly bearing witness. It is found in the gear of hikers, the kits of emergency responders, the pockets of geologists and surveyors. It sits beside the instruments of pilots and sailors, a backup not only in function but in spirit, a reminder that even the most complex technologies rest upon the simplest principles. It is also found in moments that do not involve travel. It is opened in memory, consulted in metaphor. It appears in stories and songs, not as something to fix, but as something to find. When the world feels uncertain, we speak of needing direction, and whether held in hand or imagined in the mind, the compass returns. It is small, quiet, often unnoticed, but it is steady, and perhaps that is the legacy we honor here. Not of a single invention, not of a breakthrough or a name to be carved in stone, but of constancy, of quiet service, of the ability to guide without commanding. In every chapter of its story, the compass has waited patiently to be used. It has pointed gently to something that does not change. And in a world that changes so often, that may be its greatest gift. Not to know all answers, not to promise a smooth journey, but simply to say, this way.